Good evening, everybody. And if we have not had the chance to meet yet, my name is David. I'm on staff here. I'm one of the elders here. And this weekend, obviously starting tonight, we're celebrating Easter weekend, and we're actually also ending our series. We're coming down to the end of our series that we called At the Table with Jesus, where we've been looking at all the different really stories in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus was either at a table or was telling a parable or a story that included a table. And tonight we're actually going to look at the probably most famous meal that Jesus was a part of. We're going to look at the Last Supper, or what some people call the first Lord's Supper. But before we get there, you may have noticed I'm injured. So to address the elephant in the room, 3 weeks ago, I was foolish enough to think that my 35-year-old body could play basketball like a 20-year-old body. And my Achilles tendon decided to be the bearer of bad news that I'm 35 and completely ruptured. So I had surgery Monday, and I'm on the road to recovery. Just don't look at my foot because I don't have a shoe on. So that's weird. So look at my face. But I wanted to say that obviously just to make sure you knew I wasn't just doing this for sympathy points, but also to just point out the day I got hurt, I actually had a pretty profound experience with my children that I think actually can help kind of prepare our hearts as we get ready to remember Good Friday together. So I have 3 young children. My oldest is 8, and what that means is that they have some misconceptions about me as their father. And one that I discovered 3 weeks ago when I got hurt was that to at least some degree, my kids must have still thought I was invincible. Because the day I got hurt, I drove home left-footed and got home before Shayna and the kids. And they came around back and saw their dad sitting there, hurt, in pain, unable to walk, kind of weak and vulnerable. And my kids had no idea what to do with that. They first just started doing everything they could think of. They started drawing me tons of pictures and giving them to me, which no one told them to do that. Then they started trying to serve me however they could. So they started, opening doors for me if I was limping around, or getting me, cups of water or things I couldn't carry if I was on crutches. And then lastly, they just decided to sit with me and snuggle up next to me. And I mention that because, again, my kids had no idea what to do when they saw their dad, who they thought was invincible, in this hurt, weak, and vulnerable state. And they just responded by showing love however they could. They had no idea what to do, so they just showed love however they could. And if that's how my kids respond whenever someone they think was invincible is hurt, then how much more should we respond in love when this Good Friday we remember that someone who truly is invincible, the God of the universe, was willing to be hurt for us? And as we read this story of the Last Supper, what we're actually reading is Jesus preparing his disciples to see the one that they thought was invincible get hurt. So we're going to read today in Luke 22. We're going to be in verses 14 through 23. I'll read the whole thing here and we'll get started. So when the hour came, Jesus reclined at the table and the apostles with him. Then he said to them, "I have fervently desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he said, "Take this and share it among yourselves. For I tell you, from now on, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." And he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, gave it to them, and said, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he also took the cup after supper and said, "This cup is the new covenant established by my blood. It is shed for you. But look, the hand of the one betraying me is at the table with me. For the Son of Man will go away, as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed." So they began to argue among themselves which of them it could be who was going to do this thing. This is God's word. So this passage is really full of symbolism that really wouldn't make a ton of sense to you in 2025 in America unless maybe you have a background in church or you have Jewish heritage, because this meal that Jesus is sitting at with his disciples happened at a Passover meal or during the Passover festival. And what that would have meant is that all of the nation of Israel, they would have been celebrating the time whenever they were brought out of slavery in Egypt during the time of Moses. So it would have been a time whenever freedom and deliverance and release would have been celebrated all across the nation of Israel. And it's no coincidence that this is when Jesus is having this meal with his disciples. It's no coincidence that's when Good Friday takes place. Because if you look at Jesus' ministry, really from start to finish, it's a ministry of release or of freedom. Just a few examples. He's freeing people or releasing people from sickness, from evil, from sin, even from death. And ultimately, just from all different kinds of sin and its effects in the world, Jesus was freeing people and releasing people from that. But that's not probably news for most of us here today. You've probably heard at some point in your life that Jesus can bring freedom. But if I had to guess, there are many of us here who, even though we've heard that, it's not actually a reality in our daily lives. So maybe you're newer to church and you think, well, I don't know if I really need that. I already feel pretty free. Or maybe you have the opposite experience and you've been following Jesus for years and years and years, but you feel way less free than you think you should be. You still feel beaten down and enslaved and hung up on all these different circumstances and different types of suffering you're experiencing and sin in your life. So really the goal for tonight, my goal for this little bit of time we have together as we remember Good Friday, is to bring this reality of the freedom that Jesus offers just a little bit more into our lives in real life, that we actually realize it and experience it. And to do that, we're actually going to look at the two metaphors that Jesus shares at this meal and really what they have to do with that. So we're going to look at the bread and our search for satisfaction. We're going to look at the cup and our search for justification. And then we're going to look at how the sacrifice of Jesus ends our searching altogether. So first, our first main idea today, we're going to look at the bread. I'm going to read verse 19 again. Where Jesus mentions the bread. It says, and he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, gave it to them, and said, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. So here we see Jesus associating himself with the Passover bread. And this isn't the first time that Jesus has associated himself with bread throughout his ministry. In fact, those same words that he took, blessed, broke, and gave the bread, those are the same words from when he fed the 5,000, whenever he took 5 loaves and 2 fish and fed 5,000 people. And he fed them to the point that they were completely full and there was baskets of leftovers. And that story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 is just one example of whenever bread in the Bible is clearly about more than just physical sustenance. Bread really represents this idea of complete satisfaction or wholeness or fullness. And really, this desire for satisfaction, this desire for wholeness, it's universal to humans. We all want that. But we have a problem because none of us can actually satiate it. None of us can actually finish that. We can't be satisfied through our own efforts. And the desire itself isn't a problem, but whenever we try to fill that desire to be satisfied with the wrong things, or it's aimed in the wrong directions, not only does it lead to sin in our lives, it actually leads us into a form of slavery, or a type of slavery in our lives. I wanted to read you a quote from the philosopher and theologian Dallas Willard. He was talking about this kind of inability to be satisfied as humans. He says this. He says, desire is infinite, partly because we were made by God, made for God, made to need God, and made to run on God. We can be satisfied only by the one who is infinite, eternal, and able to supply all our needs. We are only at home in God. When we fall away from God, the desire for the infinite remains, but it is displaced upon things that will certainly lead to destruction. He says the desire remains, so we just can't get rid of that. And like the Egyptian taskmasters, back whenever Israel was enslaved in Egypt, just like them, our really search for satisfaction just drives us. It drives us to work harder and harder and harder without anything to show but just emptiness for our work. So we're actually more like the enslaved people of Israel than we realize. And I was reading in Exodus, and in Exodus 2, it actually says this about the Israelites. It says they groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. And if you look around today, it's not too hard to find people or to see people who are groaning under the weight of their lives, groaning in the emptiness and dissatisfaction and the restlessness that we feel, and crying out for help. And even the most wealthy of us, the most successful of us, we're not exempt from this. Listen to this quote from Tom Brady. I really like this quote from Tom Brady, actually. Never really liked Tom Brady. But this quote is from 2005. So at that point, he only had 3 Super Bowls that he'd won, only 3. He was a multimillionaire, and he'd just been named, I think, most eligible bachelor or something weird like that. And he was on 60 Minutes, and this is what Tom Brady says. It's a direct quote. He said, "Why do I have 3 Super Bowl rings and still think there's something greater out there for me?" I mean, maybe a lot of people would say, hey, man, this is what it is. I reached my goal, my dream, but me, I think there has to be more than this. And the guy interviewing me at that point was just like kind of flabbergasted, and he's like, well, what's the answer? And Tom Brady's answer was, I wish I knew. I wish I knew. There's a person crying out for help in the midst of their slavery. Another example would be the classic song Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones, which it's so hard to read song lyrics, but this is the chorus to that song. The chorus is, I can't get no satisfaction. I can't get no satisfaction, because I try, and I try, and I try, and I try. I can't get no. So if satisfaction could be had in this world, or the things of the world that we pursue it with, the Tom Bradys and the Mick Jaggers of the world would have it. They'd be the ones who have it. But what we see here is that they're just as empty as everybody else. They just have a unique perspective because they've actually attained all of their goals and are still left feeling empty. I loved this term from the historian Arthur Schlesinger. He calls this humanity's inextinguishable discontent. Inextinguishable discontent. But here in Luke 22, Jesus says that he is the bread. And he actually expounded on this idea in John 6, where Jesus said, I am the bread of life. He said, no one who comes to me will ever be hungry, and no one who believes in me will ever be thirsty again. And later in John 6, he says, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. The bread that I will give for you, the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. So here, Jesus isn't saying that if you follow him that you'll never be disappointed, you'll get everything you've ever wanted. He's also not saying that if you follow him and do well enough that he'll reward you with the bread. What Jesus is saying is that he is the bread, and that if you get him, you'll have everything you've ever needed. You'll actually be free from this slavery of searching for satisfaction in every different way you can think of. You'll be free from that. You'll actually be completely filled in a way that nothing else can fill. But you might think, well, hey, that's a pretty big promise for Jesus to make. How can I actually trust him? And I think it's really important. I can understand that, but it's really important for us to recognize tonight that if you're not trusting Jesus for this, you're trusting something else or someone else for it. The author of Ecclesiastes calls our efforts at satisfaction, it calls it striving after wind. Another way that's translated or could be translated is feeding on wind. So if you really think about that, here we are starving, feasting on wind when there's bread on the table. There's bread available for all of us. So when you and I, when we look to the next relationship, the next project at work, even the next sermon, the next paycheck, you name it, when we look to those things for our satisfaction, what happens is we effectively make those our little gods, and we trust them to give us satisfaction. And what we all eventually come to learn is that those gods will never forgive you when you fail them. They crush you if you fail to get them. But they'll also never satisfy you if you actually get them. But Jesus, the bread of life, will forgive you when you fail him, and he will satisfy you when you get him. So that's the bread. Next, we're going to look at the cup. That's the next metaphor in this meal that Jesus shares. So I'm going to read you the three verses where Jesus talks about the cup here in Luke. We're going to look at verses 17 and 18, and then verse 20. Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he said, take this and share it among yourselves. For I tell you, from now on, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. And then down in verse 20, in the same way, he also took the cup after supper and said, this cup is the new covenant established by my blood. It is shed for you. So there's another kind of need that Jesus highlights here with the cup. So with the bread, he highlights our need for satisfaction, for wholeness or fullness. But here with the cup, Jesus actually highlights our need for what would be called justification. Maybe a better way to understand that would be he highlights our need to be as we ought to be. And now if you look around and try to get an answer for that in the world today, and you say, well, what ought I to be? You'll get a lot of different answers, but probably the most common one is you ought to be whatever you want to be. You're free to be whatever you want to be. That's what you ought to be. But the Bible actually has a different answer. The Bible would actually tell you you ought to be in right relationship with your Creator, in a loving, right relationship with God. So, with that, when you look at this idea of the blood and the cup, you actually can see that just like the original Passover lamb, the original Passover lamb, and when they were in the land of Egypt, during the final plague before they were delivered, just like the blood of the original Passover lamb would have identified the people of Israel as God's people and given them life and freedom in the midst of death. Jesus is saying here that his blood actually establishes our identity where we're actually in a right relationship with God. We're actually justified as we ought to be, and therefore receive life and freedom in the midst of death. We actually receive the life and freedom we were made for. Because, just to explain this a little bit, Jesus says here that the cup is the new covenant established by my blood. It is shed for you. If we're being honest, there's lots of words in that verse that don't resonate with us if you haven't been studying the Bible. It's got new covenant and blood. A couple things in there that nowadays you're not going to find a lot of equivalents for. So we're going to just look at those two ideas for a second here to see what does it actually have to do with our relationship with God. What does it have to do with us trying to be as we ought to be or really being justified? So first off, a covenant is something that takes place in the context of relationship. It's a promise or promises that are ratified by a vow or an oath. Really, the most common example of what we'd have today would be marriage vows, where you promise to have and to hold someone regardless of what may come. And all through the Old Testament, you actually see God making covenants with his people. But really, they're all pointing forward to what Jesus references here. They're all pointing forward to this new covenant. I'm actually going to read you when the new covenant is described. It's actually described in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34. So this is this new covenant Jesus is talking about. It says, "Look, the days are coming. This is the Lord's declaration, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. This one will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors, when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, a covenant they broke even though I had married them," the Lord's declaration. "Instead, this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days," the Lord's declaration. "I will put my teaching within them and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will one teach his neighbor or his brother, saying, 'Know the Lord,' for they all will know me, from the least to the greatest of them. This is the Lord's declaration, for I will forgive their wrongdoing and never again remember their sin." So this is the new covenant that Jesus is referencing here. He's saying there's this relationship between God and his people where from the least to the greatest, they'll all know him, and that this relationship, again, the one we were designed for, will be as we ought to be. It'll actually be possible because there'll be forgiveness of sin. And Jesus says his blood is what purchases that forgiveness. It's what makes this relationship with God we were made for. It's what makes it possible. So if you've ever wondered, okay, why did Jesus actually have to die? It's Good Friday, probably wondering that question. Why did he actually have to die? God is loving, God is forgiving. Why couldn't he just forgive? Hopefully this will help clarify that issue. So one of the main ways that sin is talked about in the Bible is as a debt. And whenever you consider that, it actually helps to understand what forgiveness actually is. So if you owed me $3,000, which would be convenient right now, I had to pay for surgery. So if you owed me $3,000, but I decided to forgive that debt, what happens to the $3,000? Does it just disappear and float off into the atmosphere? No, I lost $3,000. I paid it. That forgiveness cost me literally $3,000. So there's a cost to forgiveness. But how does that play out in interpersonal relationships? So for example, maybe kind of a minor slight, but maybe me and you set up a meeting and you run 15 minutes late to the meeting. That's not a huge deal, but you cost me 15 minutes of my life, and maybe I feel a little disrespected because we agreed on a time. Forgiveness in that case isn't just the 15 minutes. You don't just pay it in time. There's also a personal cost that I'll have to pay when I choose not to get back at you for that. When I choose not to badmouth you to others or to myself even. And when I choose not to show up 15 minutes late to our next meeting to get even. That's a cost of forgiveness. But what about whenever it's a much greater offense? What about if your spouse cheats on you? That is a much greater cost. And if someone's ever wronged you in a significant way like that, then you know this is true. You know that forgiveness is not simple, it's not easy, and it is definitely not cheap. Forgiveness is costly. And our sin against God is not of the late to a meeting variety. It's actually more like adultery. But even greater than breaking a marriage, we've broken the relationship we were made for, the relationship with our Creator. And we're told that the debt that is owed is one we can't afford. It's death. So you see here that this forgiveness that's available, it's costly, and our debt is death. But I'll say, even if you don't think you owe that debt, I guarantee you feel the weight of it. And I don't just mean because everybody dies, so you have the fear of death over you. That's one way you feel the weight of it. But I mean, every single one of us has this sense in us that we're just not as we ought to be. And really the best way to see this is all the different ways that we try to build these identities for ourselves that help us feel like we're enough or that we are all we ought to be, all the ways that we try to self-justify. So if you look around, you can see that all around us. You can see that we do it, and we can see it in our own lives too. Christian, non-Christian, we all fall back into this over and over. Whether you're trying to do it through your morality, through the way you serve others, you can try to justify yourself through your physical fitness, or through your success, or your wealth. You name it, we can try to use it as a means to self-justify. But again, just like trying to satisfy ourselves, it doesn't work. It doesn't pan out. And really what it boils down to, just like with satisfaction, this is just one more way that we end up completely enslaved to our sin. One more way that, like the Egyptian taskmasters driving Israel when they had to build bricks, and they're just building brick after brick after brick, and they have nothing to show for all their efforts. Nothing to show except for monuments for their enemies and exhaustion for themselves. The same is true for our self-justification. We're trying to make ourselves enough. We're trying to make ourselves enough. And ironically, where our culture would say, hey, you ought to be whatever you want to be. You're free to be whatever you want to be. That turns into a type of slavery as we try everything we can to find the right identity that makes us feel justified. Pastor Tim Keller, who was a pastor for years and years and years, a lot more wisdom than me, a lot more experience working with people and seeing them in the hardest times of their lives than me. He wrote this in his 70s, and he talked about this same reality, but in a very sobering way. This is what he said. He said, as a pastor, I've spoken to people nearing death who express guilt and shame for things they had done. But I've spoken to far more people who were racked with regret for the things they had not done. They realized at the end that much of their lives had been simply wasted and that their lives warranted a negative verdict. This regret assails non-religious persons as much as, if not more than, religious ones. As my wife and I have passed the age of 70, and as I have entered cancer treatments, we have ourselves felt this burden of sins of omission. We live with this invisible weight. When we are younger, we may say, nobody has the right to tell me how to live, nobody has the right to make me feel guilty, only I judge myself. But even within this framework, as the years mount, we see that we have not lived up to our own standards. The burden, barely noticed at first, gets heavier as the years go by. For more religious people, that may be guilt over specific sins they've done. For non-religious people, it may be a less specific, shameful sense of not being the persons they should be. So when Jesus says that his blood, or that the cup is his blood of this new covenant, what he's saying is that this weight, this enslavement to try to justify yourself, try to make yourself feel like enough, it can actually be completely removed. And it's not removed because you worked off the debt. It's actually removed because the debt has been paid. Completely paid in full. So you no longer have to try to be enough because you see that Jesus was enough. Thank you. I have needed that. So we're coming down closer to the end here, and as we look at Jesus' words from the Last Supper, you can see that from these things we can see there's actually freedom available to us. Again, it's not something we always experience in our daily life, but it could be. It could be. There's freedom available to us to end our search for satisfaction. There's freedom from the search for just self-justification or trying to be enough. But the question still remains, well, how does Jesus' sacrifice do that? And I think there's just very briefly, just one really important detail that really sets Christianity apart from any other world religion, any other worldview. There's one important detail that both of those things have in common, the cup and the bread, and that's that they are given. Jesus said that the bread was given. His body is given for you. that his blood is poured out for you. What he doesn't say is that you earned this, or you worked for this, or that you searched hard enough so now you can finally find it. He says it's given. He gives himself. And it's on the cross where that happens. So really a way we could frame this in our minds as we remember Good Friday today is that on the cross, Jesus is saying, you can stop searching because I have come to find you. The church father, Augustine, famously said, you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. And he's right. He's right. Until we rest in this reality, we're restless, we're just enslaved to this constant searching. And the reality is that you were actually made to experience love and joy and peace like you've never experienced before, freedom like you've never experienced before. You're made to experience that within the context of a relationship with God. So we've been talking about all through today. But again, our sin has broken that. It's made that impossible for us to repair on our own. But Good Friday is all about how Jesus has bridged the gap. And that the lengths that he was willing to go to do that for you was death on the cross, so that you and I could actually eat and drink at his table, in his kingdom. But I think we'd be remiss if on Good Friday we didn't pause and reflect and take time to realize what the cost was. Because again, it wasn't cheap, it wasn't easy. There really should be in us tears on Good Friday when we remember. I think there should be two types of tears. There should be tears of regret, tears of sadness over the pain that we've caused the God of the universe who loves us so dearly, but there should also be another type of tears. There should be tears of joy and relief. Because in him you really are free. Your search really can end. You actually do have all you can need, that you could ever need in him. So today as we end, I thought it'd be fitting just to read to us the crucifixion account from the Gospel of Luke. So I'm going to read this to us, and as I read this, worship team, you guys can actually come back on up. We're going to read this, and then we're going to end with communion today as well. So there'll be ample time to reflect as we end today and to consider the cost of Good Friday, the cost of your freedom, and the reality of your freedom, and the relief that we could have because of Jesus. So let me read this to us. This is Luke 23, verses 32 through 49. Two others, criminals, were also led away to be executed with Jesus. When they arrived at the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on the right and one on the left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, because they do not know what they are doing." And they divided his clothes and cast lots. The people stood watching, and even the leaders kept scoffing. "He saved others. Let him save himself, if this is God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him. They came offering him sour wine and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." An inscription was above him, "This is the King of the Jews." Then one of the criminals hanging there began to yell insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other answered, rebuking him, "Don't you even fear God, since you are undergoing the same punishment? We are punished justly, because we're getting back what we deserve for the things we did. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, "I assure you, today you will be with me in paradise." It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3, because the sun's light failed. The curtain of the sanctuary was split down the middle, and Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit." Saying this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what happened, he began to glorify God, saying, "This man really was righteous." All the crowds that had gathered for the spectacle, when they saw what had taken place, went home, striking their chests. But all who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things. Jesus, the bread of life, he was broken so that you could be made whole. His blood was spilled so that you could actually be who you ought to be in right relationship with him. But we can't just observe Jesus from a distance. We can't just look at him from far away and say, oh, that's a pretty nice guy. Jesus commemorated his death with a meal. Because like a meal, you can't just look at it to actually get the sustenance of the life that it provides. You have to take it in. You have to partake of it. And the way we do that is through faith, through trusting that Jesus really is who he says he is. He really did what he said he did, and he really loves you, like he's proven he loves you on the cross. So today, we're going to end with communion. It's one of the ways that we regularly drive the reality of the cross and the implications of the cross deeper and deeper into our heart so that we can be free and so that we can respond in love for what God has done for us. So as you come up today, as you take the bread, as you take the juice, when you have the bread, remember, Jesus was broken so you could be whole, you could be satisfied in him. And when you have the juice, remember, his blood was spilled that you could be justified. So during this last song, you can come up, you can get the bread, you can get the juice, and then go back to your seat and contemplate on that, pray on that. And then we'll actually take communion all together. Chris is going to lead us in communion all together right at the end, so you can hold on to it till the very end. But as we remember Good Friday today, I'm just grateful you all were here, and let's take communion and remember our Lord.